In 2023, the World Values Surveys compared 24 countries around the globe, and it found that of those countries, people in the United Kingdom were the least likely to say that work is important in their life. The UK also ranked low on the view that work should always come first, and they're less likely to agree that work is a duty to society. The United States was also included in this survey, and no surprise here to this American who grew up in American hustle culture, Americans ranked the opposite of the Brits. More likely to say that work is important, and more likely to agree that work should always come first. Brits work to live. Americans live to work. But the differences go far beyond that. And with the help of the partner in today's video, Fiverr, I'm going to Britishify, if that's a word, my professional documents while we talk about the differences. Because before you can actually experience work culture, you have to get the job, and even the job application process has some differences between the UK and the USA. I've been brushing up on my current CV/resume, we'll get to the terminology in a minute, as well as a draft cover letter and updating my LinkedIn profile, just to make sure I'm available for any opportunities and having a professional look for my work, even if it's through YouTube. And that's how I got involved with today's sponsor, Fiverr. Fiverr is a platform that connects you with freelancers in all sorts of areas, from graphic design to video editing to professional help, and I was on the hunt for someone who could help me retool my professional branding and make sure it fits within the UK. Now, let's talk about general values around work to finish our first point. American culture puts a significant amount of value on work and career paths. Instead of being valued for being a good person, being a family person, being funny, helping the homeless, or whatever it is, Americans view working as hard as possible and making as much money as possible as a positive trait. It's a cultural belief that work is not just a way to make money, but part of one's identity and purpose. In the UK, work is seen as much more of a necessity in order to financially afford your housing and your life. There are, of course, many career-minded people within the UK and many people who find satisfaction in what they do. But as a whole, culturally, there is more of a belief in the UK that a job is a job, and you are not your job. In response to the study I mentioned earlier, some British people remarked that they're very happy they ranked last in thinking work is important, stating, and I quote, "Work is important to me, but family, health, environment, culture, and other things are too. And I think that makes the UK a better place." And this attitude even reflects in CVs. Using Fiverr, I found a freelancer known as Job P, who specifically helps tailor CVs and cover letters for the British market. I submitted my existing information to him left over from years in America, and he was able to make sure that my new CV reflects British wording and culture. And that typically includes a short line about hobbies and interests. This is not the case in US resumes. They're only interested in you as a worker and definitely not as a person. Working with this freelancer also helped me to learn some more differences in how Americans and Brits talk about job applications. In the UK, the term CV is used sort of interchangeably to resume, whereas in the US, we would say that a resume is separate to a CV. An American-style CV is typically only used in academic fields or more scientific fields. And they tend to be much longer and detailed accounts of your research, publications, and awards. And British CVs, again, more equivalent to an American resume, are also a bit different than the American version. They tend to include more extensive descriptions of education and work experience and do not typically include references unless the job description asks for it. Whereas including references before they even ask for it is an important part of a US resume. Now, I chose this freelancer based on the great reviews. Another benefit of Fiverr is that you can see the past reviews for a freelancer instead of just relying on the testimonials that they share with you, which makes it a great system for finding people you can trust. Now, let's talk about how workplaces deal with personal time in a more vague sense before we get to the specifics. I should also clarify that we're mostly talking about salaried style positions here for this particular point, while the others apply to most types of jobs. And the reason I say this is because one general UK cultural trend when it comes to salaried positions is that your personal time, i.e. the time you take for lunch breaks, the time you need to go to the dentist, being able to take off time in lieu, is far less managed than in the US. Obviously, this cannot always be the case in an hourly position where you you have very dedicated break time and can't just casually call off your job in Waitrose because you have to pick up your kid from school. But the freedom employees have in salary jobs in the UK is usually more than the freedom employees have in the USA salary jobs to do similar things. There's more an emphasis in the USA that you need to be accessible at all times, and there's less flexibility if you need to have an appointment that can't be rescheduled or tend to something personal. This means that when applying for jobs in the UK, it's even more important to stress how you can manage your own time. You should always adjust your cover letter to the specific job you're applying for, but it's great to have an existing format to use. And I used Fiverr to hire Job P for a second job, this time to create me a draft cover letter for British work. In it, he made sure to include sections about being a team player who works independently, very important in a British office, as well as being flexible. Even in my CV, he was able to change some of my existing descriptions for my past work into descriptions that showed off how I had actually taken charge of something. Not only that, but he used the Fiverr messaging system to make sure I knew I could ask any questions about what he had done, as well as send him any specific jobs that would be an example of a job I might apply for in the future, so he could really personalize it as much as possible. The Fiverr messaging system is where you get to communicate directly with the freelancer taking on your job, and it's much more personal than just buying a service with no input and then getting something back without being able to connect with a human. While the typical turnaround time is listed in the Fiverr freelancer profile, Job P used the messaging system to let me know that he would have the work to me sooner and gave me a specific date to expect it so I could plan in my workflow when to review it. Anyway, as the Fiverr freelancer pointed out when tailoring my CV and cover letter, it's good practice for anyone, but particularly when applying for a salaried position in the UK, they want to know, if we trust you to take a morning off to go and deal with personal stuff, are you going to be able to manage your own time and be self-directed and getting tasks done and making that time up? And I'm glad I hired a freelancer who is much more in the know about professional development in Britain to help me make sure I emphasize that. And of course, talking about work-life balance, the differences between countries is even more set in stone when you compare the annual holiday amounts, or paid time off. In the UK, it is the law to have a minimum of 5.6 weeks per year of PTO. The law. Now, when you take these days can be at the discretion of your company. They may close over Christmas and you have to take this as PTO, but you are guaranteed this amount of holiday minimum. Do you know what the minimum amount is in the USA? It's nothing. Yeah, seriously. There is no national requirement for PTO in the USA, and each company is required to come up with their own policies. Most do offer paid time off. It's uncommon for a company to offer you absolutely nothing, but even then, the average number of days is between 10 and 15 per year, so closer to 2 to 3 weeks. And many times, if you're sick, you'll have to dig into these days. Whereas in the UK, there is separate sick leave that is allowed. I always try to be very fair in my analysis of both countries and dig into the cultural aspects of our differences without making judgments. But this is one area where I can categorically say that for employees, life is much better in the UK. The US system favors the company, while the UK still at least has some protections for the individual person, and while the workplace culture in regards to communication in the UK might be frustrating to an American, which we'll get to in a minute, the amount of time off and flexibility in the UK makes the UK much better in that regard. So let's talk about communication in the workplace. The same communication styles that we find in the UK versus the USA apply here. Workplace communication is far more indirect in the UK, with bosses saying things like, "Oh, when you get a minute," when they mean, "Actually, please do this right now." Small talk is still much more prevalent in UK work situations, and you don't want to be the person in the office who hasn't engaged in it at least a little bit before launching into the meeting or work topics. Whereas in the US, they really just want you to get to the point. In my experience, and based on research, the UK workplace is also far more filled with humor, banter, and sometimes swearing than a USA workplace. Not in every sectors, but in many, it's more relaxed. Being able to joke around and banter with your colleagues, especially ones you've known for a while, makes you an asset to the office culture and helps create a positive British work environment. Not necessarily so in the USA. It's not seen as professional, and Americans, in an attempt to come across as genuine, will joke around far less in an office setting and save it more for smaller circles outside of work. This also applies to swearing. Brits swear more than Americans already, but even in the workplace, it's seen as unprofessional to swear in many American workplaces, whereas a few well-placed swear words in a British office setting will likely go unnoticed or possibly even agreed with. That being said, of course, before you get the job, presenting yourself as a professional in the UK is still very much important. And there was another area where I felt completely overwhelmed when it comes to presenting myself professionally, and I knew Fiverr could help with this. Enter LinkedIn. I'm terrible at LinkedIn, and by terrible, I mean I don't even have one anymore, which seems crazy in today's job market because everyone's on LinkedIn. So I used Fiverr's search tool to try and find a freelancer who specifically focused on LinkedIn, and I found one with great reviews, Robert James. He specifically works to help people update their LinkedIn profiles or create one altogether. There really is a freelancer for every task. And I wanted to work with someone who just deals with LinkedIn all day because I knew that he would understand how I needed to present myself differently on LinkedIn than in a CV and cover letter. He took my CV as a starting point and turned it into the basis for a really solid LinkedIn profile that I can start to use to connect with other professionals in the content creation industry. Because the thing about LinkedIn, as Robert explained to me, is that LinkedIn is a social network site where you do present yourself as slightly more casually than on a resume while still having a professional tone. And that can be a very hard line to walk. He was able to take all of my achievements and help keyword optimize them so I would show up better in LinkedIn searches and show off the things that he knew recruiters on LinkedIn were most looking for. And I was really happy with what he provided me to create my profile. I chose the option where I could upload the data to my profile myself, but he also offers a service where he can do it for you. He also offered his email follow-up template and application tracker as freebies after he delivered the order, and I really appreciate the passion that many Fiverr freelancers have for their specific area of expertise. It's why it's so much better to use Fiverr to hire for individual tasks rather than hiring an employee or assistant to do multiple things for you. Now, when it comes to casual tones, there is one area that I have found that British workplaces are actually a bit less relaxed in than American workplaces. And that's when it comes to what you wear. Again, it completely differs by sector and even by the actual location. West Coast workplaces in the US tend to be even more casual than East Coast workplaces, so even within each country it's different, but I do think Americans dress more casually in the first place in general, and this can extend to many workplaces. Whereas the equivalent British workplace would dress up a bit more formal or smart, as they say in the UK. This is really important to know when using social networking professional profiles like LinkedIn. My next step on Fiverr after this is to hire a freelancer who specifically helps make your LinkedIn profile picture look professional. We all know I'm a pretty casual dresser and could use someone to help make sure I'm presenting myself professionally in the best light. There's also a ritual in many British workplaces that happens that would not fly in an American office. In the UK, bonding with your colleagues by moaning or complaining is pretty normal. It's that classic British everything is going wrong mentality, compared to the American view that being positive is a better trait. I used to work in a British workplace where we all actually loved our job, but would complain all day about multiple things, people, and vendors. We had to tone it down when our American colleagues visited though, because we soon found out that they believed it meant that we didn't like our jobs or just were really, really negative people, when really that wasn't the case. On the flip side, American energy levels and enthusiasm and "yay team, we've got this" energy does not fly in the UK. When coaching Americans who are coming in as managers in certain situations in the UK, they are actually told to tone this part of themselves down because people won't trust you and they need to meet their British team where they're at, which is not a cheerleading practice. I noticed this trend in the CV and cover letter that JobP provided for me for the British market. He emphasized my skills and accomplishments without the over-the-top American tone or any sort of exaggeration. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you're aware of the culture of the country you're applying for jobs in, because an American resume/CV doesn't always translate well in the UK and vice versa. And some more practical differences to finish. Brits like tea. I have always said this is not a stereotype, this is a fact, and people also like to drink tea within an office setting. People drink hot drinks like coffee in the US as well, but doing the rounds of tea culture doesn't exist in the US. And by that, I mean that in a British workplace, typically, if you're going to go make yourself a cup of tea, you should ask if anybody else would like one. And then later, when they make a cup of tea, they should ask if anybody else, including you, wants one. So people kind of end up making tea for each other in rounds. In many offices in the UK, it would be considered a little bit standoffish to go and get your own cup of tea without asking anyone else. This does not translate in the US. We don't drink tea the same way Brits do anyways, so people are getting all kinds of different drinks, and even if we did, it's an everyone fend for yourself kind of situation. Another difference has to do with the attitude towards things like job sharing and flexible working when it comes to hours. I had never heard of someone sharing a job before coming to the UK, which usually means one person works maybe 2 days of the week and the other person works the other 3 to make a total for 5 days of the week that someone is working the role. This is usually to allow people who need flexible working, maybe they're a parent, maybe they're taking care of an older relative. And I'm not saying this doesn't happen ever in the US, but in our work is life kind of culture and hustle culture, it's definitely less common to find this sort of arrangement. And most companies would say if you can't work the full 5 days of the job, then don't bother applying. And finally, when it comes to the abrupt end to a job, not quitting, but being fired, hopefully you've never experienced it, but the risk of being fired for no real reason is much higher in the USA. 49 out of 50 states, all excluding Montana, follow what is known as at-will employment. And that means that while you still cannot discriminate against someone for their race, gender, or protected class, you can fire them for basically any other reason at any time. You don't even need to give a reason. If tomorrow the boss walks in and decides they don't like people who wear red shoes and you wore red shoes that day, they could fire you with absolutely no legal fault on their part or recourse on your part. In the UK, there are much more stringent laws and regulations surrounding firing someone. It involves paperwork trails, ensuring you're giving notice to the employee to make sure they know they're at risk, documenting the reasons why. It has to be a valid reason like poor performance or misconduct, etc. Not just because they brought in brownies when you would have preferred they brought in cake to the office party. And so it makes sense that Americans are more concerned about their jobs and feel a real sense of needing to work longer hours and prove themselves more than in the UK, because there's less of a safety net there in terms of their job security. Now that brings me to the end of this video. I feel like we've all learned a lot. I definitely have after working with Fiverr's freelancers to Britishify, I'm making it a word now, myself professionally. Maybe you share similar needs and wanting to spruce up your CV or LinkedIn profile, or you might need something else done entirely. Fiverr can help with so many different things. They can do voiceovers, creating blog articles, designing a website, or even doing something even more niche, like teaching yoga sessions or providing personal fitness training plans. Fiverr freelancers cover such a wide variety of tasks and areas that you'd be hard-pressed to find something that they can't do. If you want to try out Fiverr for yourself, make sure to use the link in my description and use my code GIRLGONELONDON for a 10% discount. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.